The moment I saw the HOA's bulldozers rumbling down the private road toward my lake mansion, my stomach sank, but a slow, dangerous smile began to creep across my face, because they had no idea that this entire property, every gleaming wall, every dock, every inch of shoreline, was legally mine, every square foot traced, recorded, and untouchable, and they were about to pay for every ounce of arrogance, every petty fine, every phone call full of threats, every letter demanding compliance with rules that only existed to torment me. And yet in this exact moment, with the machines approaching and my neighbors peeking out from behind hedges in half-suspicious, half-terrified curiosity, I felt an intoxicating calm wash over me, because unlike them, I had patience, and I had a plan that would unfold like a storm the second they made their first mistake, and the mistake was already written in the reckless confidence that radiated off the HOA president like she owned the world. She did not see me standing by the dock, clipboard in hand, smiling as if the apocalypse itself was a casual Saturday morning, and I watched as her face twisted into that familiar mask of entitlement, the one that had caused more destruction to relationships in this neighborhood than any actual storm ever could, and I thought back to the countless petty wars that had led to this day, the ridiculous fines for planting the wrong flowers, the letters demanding I cut down century-old trees because they blocked views, the neighborly complaints about nothing at all, the meetings that lasted hours where everyone just shouted over each other while the HOA board nodded as if they were gods of morality, when in truth they were just bureaucrats drunk on small-town power, and now here they were, the giant machines barreling toward my property like invaders, thinking that $100 in a bribe or a fine could make me flinch or sell out the lakefront I had worked a decade to build, and as the first bulldozer's treads ground over my perfectly manicured lawn, the sound made a sickening crunch that echoed off the water like a warning bell, but I didn't panic. I leaned against my dock railing, my eyes narrowing as I pulled out my phone, and in the next few seconds, I activated a series of legal documents, insurance policies, and surprise maneuvers that would make the HOA wish they had never set foot on my land, because every move they had made to destroy my mansion for what they assumed was petty retaliation would become a spectacularly costly mistake, and it all started with a single phone call to the county records office, where a friendly voice on the other end confirmed what the HOA had somehow never bothered to check. I own not just the mansion, not just the lakefront, but every road leading to it, every dock, every shared easement, every inch of property surrounding it, and legally, they had zero right to touch a single thing, and with that knowledge, I started the next step in a plan that had been years in the making, a plan designed to let them feel invincible, to let them take what they thought was mine by mere oversight, while I sat back and waited for the legal and financial storm that would utterly decimate their petty empire, because entitlement has a price, and today they were about to learn it in the harshest way possible, and as the bulldozers pushed forward, I smiled wider, because the first act of my revenge was to let them destroy the $5 million mansion for $100, knowing the paperwork and proof of ownership I had in my hands would turn every shovel of dirt, every smashed window, and every flattened hedge into their personal catastrophe, and as I watched the first wall of the mansion tremble under the heavy metal claws of destruction, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation, because they were still blind to the full extent of my control, still unaware that I had not just the mansion, but the legal right to reclaim, sue, and enforce every inch of land with a force that would make every HOA board member think twice before ever crossing someone again. And in that moment, standing on my private dock, listening to the grinding metal and the panicked shouts of the workers as the first signs of chaos appeared, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the storm I had been planning in secret, waiting for the perfect moment, was about to hit, and it would leave the HOA utterly shattered, legally bankrupt, and humiliated beyond repair, and all because they assumed that power, not law, ruled here when in reality the law, and I, ruled absolutely, invisibly, and unassailably, and as I dialed the next number, summoning county inspectors, lawyers, and a few very special surprises, I could almost hear the mansion whispering back at me, "Let them destroy me, but they'll regret it all." And I knew it was right, because entitlement and ignorance combined is the deadliest combination, and today the HOA would learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. And as the machines moved deeper onto my land, the first act of my master plan unfolded perfectly. They thought they were taking everything from me, but the truth was that with every swing of a bulldozer and every reckless step on my lawn, they were digging the hole they would soon fall into, and I, watching from the water's edge, calm and patient, was ready to let them drown in the consequences of their own arrogance. The first scream didn't come from me or even from the mansion as another wall cracked and collapsed into a cloud of dust. It came from the HOA president when her phone started buzzing uncontrollably in her hand, and I knew instantly that the dominoes had begun to fall, because power like hers only exists in silence, and the moment outside voices enter the picture, the illusion shatters. And as I stood there watching the chaos unfold across what the HOA arrogantly labeled a non-compliant structure, I could see the exact second when certainty drained from her face and was replaced by something far more satisfying. Fear, the raw kind that crawls up from the stomach when someone realizes they may have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. And while she barked orders at the construction crew to keep going and finish the job, her voice trembled just enough to betray her, because somewhere deep down she already knew this wasn't just another homeowner she could bully into submission with fines and threats. This wasn't another neighbor who would cave under pressure and sell at a loss. And as the men hesitated, exchanging looks that said they suddenly wanted nothing to do with this job, I slowly walked closer, my shoes crunching over broken glass and stone, the remains of what had once been a $5 million lake mansion designed to be timeless, a place I had built not just to live in but to anchor a long-term plan that the HOA never bothered to question. And I calmly asked her if she'd received the county notice yet, watching her eyes flicker with confusion before she snapped back that I was trespassing and needed to leave immediately. And that was when I laughed, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already won and was merely watching the other side struggle against gravity. And I told her that trespassing laws were very specific, especially when it came to private roads, private lakes, and private land, and that perhaps she should check the attachments on the email she had just received. And in that moment the air itself seemed to tighten, because she finally stopped yelling and started reading, her lips moving silently as the reality of her situation began to take shape word by word, line by line, parcel by parcel. And the longer she read, the paler she became, until the clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed louder than the bulldozers ever could. And around us the neighbors had gathered closer now, sensing blood in the water, whispers rippling through the crowd as people began pulling out their phones, recording, texting, calling, because nothing spreads faster in an HOA-controlled community than scandal. And I could already hear the narrative shifting in real time, from defiant homeowner gets taught a lesson, to HOA overreach destroys private property. And that was before the sheriff's vehicle appeared at the end of the road, lights flashing lazily as if the universe itself had decided to stroll in and watch the show. And the HOA president spun toward me, her voice suddenly softer, almost pleading as she asked what this was really about, as if this had all been a misunderstanding that could still be smoothed over with an apology or a small settlement. And I told her the truth, that it was about control, about years of unchecked authority wielded without accountability, about a board that fined people into silence and forced compliance without ever checking whether they actually had the legal standing to do so. And I explained that while she was busy collecting $100 penalties and threatening liens, I had quietly acquired land, registered easements, purchased shoreline rights, and consolidated ownership in a way that made this entire development functionally dependent on my property. And the realization hit her like a physical blow when she understood that this lake, the centerpiece of the community, the thing they marketed in glossy brochures and bragged about in HOA meetings, was legally mine. The access roads were mine, the docks were mine, and the water rights themselves were mine, all neatly documented and filed years ago, because while the HOA was busy policing lawn height and mailbox colors, I was building a legal fortress that didn't announce itself until it was needed, and now it was needed. And as the sheriff stepped out of his vehicle and approached, greeting me by name, the HOA president's last shred of confidence evaporated completely, because nothing terrifies an HOA like law enforcement that doesn't answer to them. And when the sheriff asked who authorized the demolition, her mouth opened and closed like she couldn't quite remember how words worked anymore, and she stammered about violations and fines and community standards. And that was when I handed the sheriff the binder, thick, meticulously organized, impossible to argue with, and watched as his expression shifted from polite neutrality to concern, then to something bordering on disbelief, and he turned back to the HOA board members who had arrived moments earlier, asking them if they were aware they were standing on privately owned land without permission, overseeing the destruction of a legally registered structure. And the silence that followed was deafening, because the answer was no, they were not aware, they had never checked, never questioned, never imagined that someone would quietly outmaneuver them instead of fighting them openly. And as the sheriff instructed the crew to shut down operations immediately, the machines groaned to a halt one by one, their engines idling like beasts, suddenly realizing they had been leashed. And I could see panic spreading through the HOA board like a disease, each member realizing that their personal liability might extend far beyond an embarrassing meeting or a stern letter, because this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was destruction of property, trespassing, and potential criminal negligence. And the neighbors, sensing the shift, leaned in even closer, phones raised higher, because nothing fuels community gossip like watching the powerful fall, and I took a moment then to look back at the mansion, or what was left of it, and felt no regret, because every crack in the walls and every crushed beam represented leverage, evidence, and a future settlement that would dwarf any fine they had ever issued. And as the HOA president finally looked at me again, her eyes glassy and unfocused, she whispered that they could make this right, that they could rebuild, compensate, negotiate, and I told her calmly that this was no longer about making it right, it was about consequences, and that the $100 they thought they could use to humiliate me had just become the most expensive decision in the history of this association, because the insurance claims were already filed. The attorneys were already engaged, and the county was already investigating how an HOA managed to authorize demolition on land it didn't own, and as the sheriff escorted the board members aside for questioning, I stepped back toward the lake, watching the water ripple softly against the dock, completely indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its shores, and I realized that this was the moment the story would change forever, because from here on out, every move the HOA made would be reactive, defensive, and desperate, while mine would remain calculated, patient, and devastatingly precise. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows stretched long across the ruined mansion, I knew that Section 2 of this ordeal wasn't about loss. It was about exposure, the kind that strips away authority and leaves nothing behind but accountability, and the HOA had no idea just how much more of that was coming next. By the time the HOA emergency meeting was announced that evening, the neighborhood was already buzzing like a live wire, because nothing terrifies a tightly controlled community more than the sudden realization that the rules might not apply equally anymore. And as I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, yes, the same clubhouse built on an easement I quietly owned, the irony was so rich it almost felt scripted, and I could see groups of neighbors clustered together, whispering, pointing, some angry, some confused, some secretly thrilled to watch the board finally sweat. And when I walked inside, the room went silent in that unnatural way that only happens when people realize they're looking at someone who has just flipped the power dynamic upside down, and the HOA president sat at the head of the table, her posture stiff, her expression rehearsed, but the confidence she usually wore like armor was gone, replaced by a brittle calm that cracked the moment she opened her mouth and tried to frame the demolition as an unfortunate misunderstanding, because the word misunderstanding has a way of sounding hollow when there are photos, permits, timestamps, and official county seals floating around on half the phones in the room, and as she spoke, I quietly took a seat near the back, placing my binder on the table beside me like a loaded weapon I didn't even need to touch yet, and one by one, neighbors began to speak up, not in my defense at first but in their own, asking pointed questions about fines they had paid, threats they had received, notices they had been too afraid to challenge, and with each question, the board members grew more uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs as the illusion of unanimous authority began to crumble under the weight of collective doubt. And that was when I stood up, not raising my voice, not demanding attention, because silence has far more power when people are already leaning forward to hear it, and I told them the truth, calmly and methodically, explaining how the HOA had authorized the destruction of a privately owned structure without verifying ownership, how they had ignored county records, dismissed formal notices, and relied entirely on their own internal assumptions. And as I spoke, I watched comprehension ripple through the crowd, because this wasn't just about my mansion anymore. It was about a system that had been operating on fear and ignorance, assuming no one would ever push back hard enough to expose it, and I explained that while they were issuing $100 fines like weapons, I was documenting patterns, archiving correspondence, and building a case not just for property damage, but for abuse of authority. And when someone asked how the HOA could possibly miss something as big as land ownership, I answered honestly, because they never thought they had to check, because unchecked power breeds laziness, and laziness breeds catastrophic mistakes, and the room erupted then, voices overlapping, some angry at the board, some angry at me, some demanding answers, refunds, resignations, and I let it happen because chaos is necessary before reform, and eventually the HOA president banged her gavel uselessly, trying to regain control, but it was already gone. And that was when I dropped the next revelation, the one that truly shifted the ground beneath them, explaining that the HOA's insurance provider had already been notified of the unauthorized demolition, and that coverage might be denied due to negligence, which meant personal liability for board members who voted in favor of the action, and the color drained from their faces in unison, because fines and angry emails are one thing, but personal financial ruin is another entirely, and as murmurs turned into outright accusations among the board themselves, fingers pointing, voices rising, I calmly added that the clubhouse itself, the parking lot, and the access road were all built on land under my ownership, subject to easements that could be revoked or renegotiated, and the effect was immediate and visceral, because suddenly the meeting place itself felt unstable, as if the floor beneath them could disappear with a single signature, and someone in the crowd laughed. A short, sharp sound of disbelief. And that laughter spread not because it was funny but because it was absurd, because the people who had enforced rules with iron certainty were now sitting in a room they didn't fully control, and as the meeting spiraled further, I realized that this wasn't even the climax yet. It was merely the unraveling, the slow, public exposure of a structure that had relied on intimidation rather than legitimacy, and when the HOA president finally called for a recess, I stepped outside into the cool night air, my phone buzzing with messages from attorneys, reporters, and even neighbors from adjacent communities who had heard what happened and wanted to know how to challenge their own HOAs, and standing there under the dim parking lot lights, listening to the muffled shouting from inside, I understood something important. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it had become a cautionary tale, a live demonstration of what happens when authority goes unchecked for too long, and as I looked back at the clubhouse, knowing I held the legal leverage to shut it down entirely if I chose to, I smiled, not out of spite, but out of certainty, because Section 3 wasn't about revenge, it was about collapse, the kind that starts quietly, spreads publicly, and leaves nothing standing but the truth, and the HOA had just crossed the point of no return, whether they realized it yet or not. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with attention so thick it could be cut with a knife, because after the public unmasking of the HOA's authority, or lack thereof, rumors spread faster than wildfire, and by the time I drove down the private road, I could see clusters of neighbors already gathered along the shoreline, pointing at the remnants of the mansion and whispering, speculating, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smirking in satisfaction at the poetic justice unfolding before them, and as I stepped onto the dock, I noticed how even the birds seemed to pause, as if aware that the power dynamics in this tiny, tightly controlled community had shifted irreversibly, and when the HOA president arrived in her sedan, her face pale and taut with stress, I didn't move to greet her, didn't even acknowledge her presence at first, because the beauty of letting someone stew in the consequences of their own decisions is that their anxiety becomes performance art. And she approached cautiously, her heels clicking on the weathered wood, voice quivering as she attempted to assert control, but every word was drowned out by the reality staring her in the face. The mansion, the dock, the lakefront, the private roads leading here, all legally mine, and the county inspectors who had arrived earlier to confirm documentation were still on site, reviewing permits and signing off on official reports that rendered every action she had taken illegal, and as she opened her mouth to speak, I finally turned, my expression neutral, almost serene, and I reminded her calmly, almost conversationally, that trespassing laws are not suggestions, that authorizing destruction without verifying ownership carries both civil and criminal liabilities, and that her attempts to maintain authority in front of the community had collapsed under the weight of irrefutable documentation, and the shock in her eyes was satisfying in a quiet, deliberate way because she had spent years wielding authority as if it were a weapon, assuming no one would ever challenge her or the board, and now every phone recording, every inspection report, and every county confirmation was a hammer striking down her illusion of power. And while the onlookers whispered among themselves, some openly cheering, others gasping at the audacity, I moved closer to the edge of the dock and began walking slowly along the shoreline, letting the breeze off the lake carry the sounds of judgment. In the form of frustrated shouts from the HOA board members who were finally realizing they could be held personally liable for the destruction they had sanctioned. And as I surveyed the damage, windows shattered, walls cracked, the lawn scarred by heavy machinery, I felt no anger, no desire for revenge beyond the natural course of justice, because this was not about vengeance. It was about proving a point, exposing arrogance, and enforcing the law in a way that left no ambiguity, and when the HOA president finally stammered out an apology, barely audible over the hum of the county vehicles and the whispers of neighbors, I let her words hang there unacknowledged, because an apology without acknowledgement of responsibility is meaningless, and as I continued walking, I noticed several board members huddled together, debating whether to call their attorneys, the tension in their postures speaking volumes, because the realization had set in that this entire scenario could lead to lawsuits, personal financial liability, and the collapse of their reign over the neighborhood, and in that moment, I realized the magnitude of what had been unleashed, because the community had witnessed not just a correction of a wrong, but the collapse of a system built on fear and unchecked power, and they would never forget it, and the whispers soon turned into conversations, then heated debates about accountability, property rights, and the responsibility of leaders to act within the law. And I watched it all unfold from the edge of the lake, knowing that Section 4 wasn't about confrontation or spectacle. It was about the slow, irreversible transformation of the neighborhood itself, because when people see authority challenged and law enforced, it changes their perspective forever, and the HOA would no longer be able to operate under the assumptions of untouchable dominance. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the damaged mansion, I understood that the true victory wasn't in the ruined walls, but in the message sent loud and clear: arrogance and ignorance cannot coexist with careful preparation and patience. And in the weeks that followed, as legal letters were filed, insurance claims processed, and the HOA board struggled to regain credibility, I watched from my dock, calm, knowing that the lakefront, and the authority over it, was finally irrefutably mine, and that this quiet but powerful reversal of control would echo through the neighborhood for years, changing everything about how people interacted with the HOA, and leaving me in a position of quiet dominance, unchallenged and completely secure because I had let them act, watched them destroy what they thought they controlled, and allowed the law, documentation, and preparation to turn their arrogance into their downfall. The collapse didn't come with sirens or shouting this time. It came quietly, wrapped in certified mail, legal filings, and the slow, suffocating realization that the HOA's authority had evaporated overnight, because within days of the demolition, the association's insurance provider formally denied coverage, citing gross negligence and failure to verify ownership, and that single letter detonated like a bomb behind closed doors, setting off a chain reaction that no amount of emergency meetings or panicked emails could stop. And I knew this because my attorneys were copied on everything, every frantic attempt by the board to shift blame, every desperate effort to rewrite meeting minutes, every late-night message trying to pin responsibility on contractors or clerical errors. But paper has memory and arrogance leaves fingerprints, and as the lawsuits began to stack, property destruction, trespass, abuse of authority, emotional distress, the HOA's carefully curated image cracked beyond repair, and neighbors who had once been silent started lining up to testify, bringing binders of their own, wrongful fines, intimidation letters, forced compliance, threats of liens that had never been legally valid, and suddenly my case was no longer a singular event but the catalyst for a full-scale reckoning, and the board members who once sat tall behind folding tables now avoided eye contact in public, some quietly resigning, others clinging desperately to titles that no longer carried weight. And when the bank froze the HOA's accounts pending investigation, the reality finally hit the entire community like a cold wave, because landscaping stopped, security contracts were suspended, utilities for shared spaces went unpaid, and the very infrastructure the HOA bragged about began to crumble under the absence of funds, all while the irony remained unmistakable. The lake, the roads, the access points, the lifeblood of the neighborhood, were still legally mine, and when I formally notified the association that access would require renegotiated easements under lawful terms, the panic escalated into open desperation, because without those easements, the HOA had nothing to enforce, nothing to offer, nothing to stand on, and the president, former president now, stripped of her position by a unanimous emergency vote, requested a private meeting, her tone unrecognizable from the woman who once issued threats and fines without blinking, and when she sat across from me, hands trembling slightly, I could see the weight of consequence finally settling in, and she admitted what I already knew. They never thought anyone would challenge them like this, never imagined someone would quietly prepare instead of loudly protesting, never believed that the smallest fine they issued could trigger the collapse of everything they controlled, and I listened without interruption, because this was not the moment for gloating, it was the moment for resolution, and I told her plainly that I would rebuild the mansion, not as it was, but stronger, smarter, and entirely insulated from HOA interference, and that the association would either dissolve voluntarily or operate under strict legal oversight moving forward, with transparent audits, elected leadership, and binding limitations on authority. And when she nodded, defeated, I felt no triumph, only a deep sense of finality, because this was never about winning a fight, it was about ending one, permanently, and in the months that followed, construction resumed under my direction, the shoreline restored, the dock reinforced, and the new mansion rose not as a symbol of wealth, but as a monument to preparation and patience, and neighbors stopped by often, some to apologize, some to thank me, some simply to witness what happens when unchecked power finally meets its match, and as the HOA formally dissolved, its charter revoked, its assets liquidated to settle claims, the community transformed into something quieter, fairer, governed not by fear but by mutual respect. And on the day I moved back into the rebuilt home, standing on the balcony overlooking the lake at sunset, I reflected on how easily this could have gone differently if I had reacted emotionally instead of strategically, if I had fought loudly instead of documenting quietly, if I had assumed power was something granted rather than something proven, and I realized that letting the HOA destroy my $5 million lake mansion for $100 wasn't a loss at all. It was an investment, the cheapest price I could have paid to expose corruption, reclaim control, and ensure that no one would ever mistake authority for ownership again. And as the water reflected the sky in perfect stillness, I knew the story was complete, not because everything was rebuilt, but because everything was finally, unequivocally mine. The weeks after the HOA collapse were quieter than I expected. But that silence carried a weight far heavier than any shouting or confrontation ever could, because when power crumbles, it does so not with noise but with the eerie, suffocating stillness of those who realize they have nowhere left to turn. And I woke that morning not to alarms or threats but to the soft ripple of water against my dock, the kind of calm that hides storms in plain sight. And as I sipped coffee on the balcony, overlooking the lake, I reflected on the sequence of events that had transformed not just my property but the entire neighborhood, because what had begun as a tactical patience exercise, allowing the HOA to destroy what they believed they controlled, had become a masterclass in leverage, consequence, and timing, and I could see it in the subtle changes around me. Neighbors speaking openly at community meetings without fear, the local news covering the collapse of the HOA as a cautionary tale, attorneys calling to offer advice or simply to congratulate the clever orchestration of legal inevitability, and even the workers who had once thoughtlessly leveled walls now approached with deferential caution, as if the mansion itself had become a living, breathing symbol of rightful ownership and consequence. And while some might have been tempted to gloat, I knew the real power wasn't in revenge, it was in control, the ability to shape outcomes quietly and unassailably, and that control had far-reaching consequences because as the first lawsuit settled, the board members' personal finances were tied up in liabilities, public records had been updated to reflect my ownership and easements, and any future attempts to challenge my authority would be met with layers of documentation, oversight, and legal precedent. And even beyond the legalities, the social landscape had shifted dramatically, because fear is contagious, and the neighbors who had once whispered in corners about petty HOA fines were now openly questioning authority, advocating for fairness, and even challenging decisions made in meetings that had previously been rubber-stamped without scrutiny. And I realized then that the mansion, once just a house, had become a symbol of empowerment, not just for me but for the community as a whole, because it proved that knowledge, preparation, and patience could topple arrogance. And as the new landscaping crew began restoring the shoreline, planting trees and reinforcing the docks, I watched their methodical work with the satisfaction of someone who understood that rebuilding was as much about signaling permanence as it was about aesthetics. And when the HOA president, or what remained of her leadership, attempted to contact me through formal channels, I replied not with anger or threats, but with calm, firm legal instructions. All communication must go through attorneys, all claims must be substantiated, and any unauthorized action would be met with immediate legal consequences, and that restraint was deliberate because the greatest leverage comes not from reaction, but from control of narrative, timing, and procedure. And as I looked across the lake to the homes that bordered mine, seeing neighbors repair fences, adjust docks, and engage in conversations about rights, responsibilities, and boundaries, I knew that the transformation had spread far beyond the mansion itself, because the HOA's failure had demonstrated vividly that authority is not granted by titles or committees, it is validated by legality, accountability, and respect, and the subtle hum of the restored ecosystem, the chirping of birds, the lapping of waves, the distant hum of machinery, felt like a living testament to the strategy that had brought me here. And even as challenges arose in the form of lingering disputes, minor claims, and residual resentment from former board members, each one was now carefully neutralized, not through confrontation but through documentation, reminders of precedent, and the quiet reinforcement of ownership, control, and consequence. And in that quiet, I finally allowed myself to feel the full scope of satisfaction, because the mansion had not just been rebuilt, it had been redeemed, reinforced, and transformed into the ultimate statement of patience, preparation, and strategic foresight. And as the sun set behind the hills, painting the water in hues of gold and crimson, I realized that this chapter, though technically ongoing in the legal sense, was complete in principle because what had begun as a calculated risk had blossomed into an indisputable demonstration of authority, consequence, and absolute control. And from that moment on, every glance toward the water, every reflection in the lake, reminded me not of destruction, but of triumph, quiet, methodical, and irrevocable, the kind of victory that doesn't scream in the streets, but echoes forever in the laws, the minds, and the memories of all who dared underestimate it. The neighborhood had not yet fully recovered from the shockwaves of the HOA's collapse when the next chapter of consequences quietly began to unfold, because while the legal battles were ongoing, the social and psychological impact was far more immediate and visceral. And as I walked along the newly restored shoreline one morning, the subtle hum of activity, neighbors inspecting boundaries, contractors reinforcing docks, landscapers replanting trees, created an almost surreal calm that masked the lingering tension just beneath the surface, because people don't forget humiliation or exposure quickly, and the former board members, once emboldened by assumed authority, were now navigating the delicate terrain of public perception, potential lawsuits, and personal liability, and I observed them from a distance, noting how each interaction carried the weight of fear, defensiveness, and barely concealed panic, because every step they took had to be calculated, every word measured, and every attempt to regain influence scrutinized under the watchful eyes of a community that had learned a very harsh lesson about power, oversight, and accountability, and in that moment, I realized the mansion had become more than a home. It was a symbol, a living case study in strategy, patience, and preparation, teaching everyone around me that appearances mean nothing if legal authority and rightful ownership are ignored, and the irony was exquisite, because they had once believed that a $100 fine, a threat, or a letter could control me, when in truth, it had been their arrogance that allowed me to orchestrate a situation so perfect that it would haunt the association and its leaders for years to come. And as I stood there, watching the sunlight glint off the water and illuminate the freshly restored exterior of the mansion, I could see the subtle shift in the neighbors' attitudes, the quiet acknowledgement that my approach had not just defended property but redefined expectations of fairness, lawfulness, and leadership. And even the most skeptical members of the community were beginning to understand that unchecked power can crumble quickly under the weight of diligence, documentation, and timing. And as the former HOA president approached, this time cautiously, her face a mixture of defeat, tentative respect, and lingering fear, I allowed her to speak, listening to her halting words as she admitted, without any prompting, that she had underestimated the extent of my control, that her actions had been reckless, and that the consequences were beyond what she had ever imagined. And I responded not with anger but with quiet, unassailable clarity. The law, the documentation, and careful preparation were what mattered, and the rest, the destruction, the fines, the humiliation, had simply exposed the vulnerabilities of those who assume authority without understanding it, and as she walked away defeated, the atmosphere around the lake felt charged as if the very air recognized the magnitude of what had been achieved, because the collapse of the HOA's power had rippled outwards, emboldening neighbors to question authority, to stand up for their rights, and to demand accountability where before there had only been fear. And in the following days, I received letters from residents thanking me, attorneys requesting insight on similar cases, and even former board members cautiously seeking advice on how to navigate the aftermath without further legal jeopardy. And while I carefully considered each communication, I realized that Section 7 was not about revenge, nor was it even strictly about property. It was about control, legacy, and the demonstration that calculated patience and knowledge of law can outmatch brute force and arrogance in ways that are both immediate and enduring. And as I walked the perimeter of the lakefront, watching contractors complete the final touches on the restored mansion and landscaped grounds, I understood that the real victory had always been invisible, the power to act decisively while the opposition believed they were in control, and the quiet, simmering satisfaction of knowing that years of careful planning had allowed me to turn what they perceived as a $100 nuisance into a multidimensional, irrevocable collapse of authority that would resonate in the neighborhood for generations. And as dusk fell over the water, casting long reflections of the mansion and surrounding property, I allowed myself a rare private smile, because the story was reaching its zenith, and I knew that Section 8 would not be about destruction, exposure, or panic. It would be about consolidation, restoration, and the complete and undeniable establishment of rightful control, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, because the lessons had already been imprinted on the landscape, the law, and the collective memory of everyone who had ever doubted or underestimated it. The morning I returned to the mansion, fully rebuilt and fortified, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and fresh-cut grass. But beneath that tranquility, the legacy of the HOA's collapse hung like a silent monument, because every neighbor, every former board member, every contractor and attorney who had followed the saga understood that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. And as I walked along the edge of the lake, observing the gentle ripple of water against the reinforced docks, I reflected on how years of strategic patience, careful legal preparation, and deliberate inaction had culminated not in a single moment of chaos, but in the enduring establishment of control, authority, and precedent. and as the sunlight caught the glass of the mansion's windows, gleaming across the lake like a lighthouse beacon, I realized the symbolism was perfect. Clarity, transparency, and the undeniable weight of rightful ownership, because the mansion now stood not just as a home, but as a statement, a warning, and a teaching tool in one, demonstrating that power assumed without knowledge is nothing compared to power earned through patience and meticulous planning, and the HOA president, now resigned and publicly humiliated, had learned a lesson that would ripple through any future attempts at intimidation or overreach, because every legal document, every county filing, every public record and certified letter I had filed over the years created an unassailable fortress of evidence, leaving no room for ignorance or arrogance to hide. And as neighbors arrived to greet me, some with apologies, some with congratulations, others merely curious, the atmosphere was transformed from tension to respect, because witnessing careful strategy triumph over blind authority has a way of reshaping perceptions permanently, and the reconstruction itself had been more than physical. It was psychological, legal, and social, reinforcing that control is most effective when exercised subtly, invisibly, and irrevocably. And as I stood on the balcony overlooking the lake, I watched the water reflect the surrounding homes, the restored shoreline, and the glinting mansion, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the HOA could never again threaten, fine, or intimidate me without triggering legal and social consequences of unparalleled magnitude. And even as the last contractors packed up their tools and the neighbors dispersed, the mansion exuded an aura of unshakable authority, the kind that doesn't need guards, barricades, or signs, because the combination of law, planning, and patience had rendered any challenge both futile and costly. And in that moment, I understood the final truth. Victory is not about confrontation, spectacle, or immediate retaliation. It is about careful orchestration, invisibly preparing the battlefield so that when your opponents act recklessly, they walk straight into the consequences they never imagined. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden reflections across the lake, the HOA's arrogance had been replaced with caution. The neighborhood had learned that authority is earned, verified, and accountable, and my $5 million mansion, once under threat for a mere $100, stood as an enduring testament to strategy, preparation, and the irrefutable power of knowledge, ownership, and patience. A symbol that even in a world where the entitled assume dominance, those who quietly prepare can orchestrate outcomes beyond imagination. And as the lake mirrored the colors of the sky, I finally allowed myself to breathe, knowing that every legal, social, and symbolic victory had been secured, every lesson had been taught, and the neighborhood, the mansion, and the legacy of careful strategy would never forget the day when arrogance met consequence, and patience met triumph, and the story at last reached its satisfying, inevitable conclusion.